Hello, my name is Steve, and today I'm standing inside of the Spanish town of Avila. Specifically, I'm standing near the Santa Maria gate, the Puerta de Santa Maria. I'm here to do a story about one of the most famous residents of Avila who lived in the 13th century, Moses de Leon. Moses was the author of the Zohar, perhaps the most important Jewish work of mysticism of all time. Moses lived in Avila the last part of his years. He died either in Avila or nearby. I believe he's buried here in Avila. Even if he didn't die in Avila, he would have been buried here. Tomorrow, I'll be going on a tour, a guided tour, and we're going to see some of the sites where Moses de Leon would have lived, where he would have written some of the Zohar, and the cemetery where I believe he's buried. But before we get into that, we need to talk a little bit about what it is that Moses de Leon wrote. What is the Zohar? What is its connection to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah? And then, tomorrow, we'll learn more about where Moses de Leon lived. So to begin our story, Moses de Leon was born sometime between 1240 and 1250 AD, which would have been just some few decades after the start of the Spanish Inquisition, which is important to understand given the times that he lived in and the way that he had to write the Zohar. Moses de Leon was born in either De Leon or in Guadalajara. He would have traveled around Spain, visiting other synagogues and other schools, and he would have studied with other rabbis and read from other Kabbalistic works. There are apocryphal stories that he ordered a copy of Maimonides' work, which would have had to have been hand-scribed for him, as this was before the invention of the printing press. So let's talk a little bit about what the Zohar, his most important work, not his only work, but certainly his most important work, comprised of nearly 2,000 pages, describing the hidden secrets of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. The Zohar presents the story of several wandering rabbis wandering around a fictional area of Palestine. On my way into Avila today, I noticed that much of the landscape in this area has a certain resemblance to the rolling hills and forests that also comprise much of the landscape of the Zohar. So I can see where he got his inspiration from. The Zohar tells the story of these wandering rabbis who meet other characters and learn from them. Sometimes they are wise men, sometimes they are donkey drivers who turn out to be wise men, sometimes it's other rabbis, sons of rabbis. In all these cases, the Zohar presents the secrets of Kabbalah in such a way that it uses the key tenets of Judaism, its rituals, its prayers, its holidays, its family life, as lessons to learn on how to become more spiritual and how to have what is one of the key objectives of Kabbalah, which is to have a personal relationship with God. It's also another important lesson of Kabbalah is to perfect the world, to return the world essentially to a state of Eden through good deeds, good thoughts, good actions, and spiritual development. And that is what the Zohar is all about. As I mentioned earlier, the Zohar was written by De Leon sometime in the late 13th century. And it would have been written at a time when the Catholic Church was rising in importance, the Christian orders of monasteries were increasing throughout Europe, and they were gaining more influence. And you can see many references in the Zohar to the monastic life, to the Virgin Mary, and other Christian beliefs, but because it was written at a time when Jews had to be very careful about being overly critical of the Christian church, they were often written in a way to disguise these criticisms. Plausible deniability, if you will. The last 8 years, I've spent writing a commentary on the Zohar, and I've written over 600 pages so far. That's what made me have such an interest in coming to Avila to see where Moses de Leon lived and where he wrote. Unfortunately, much of the Jewish quarter was destroyed in the 15th century when the Jews were expelled from Spain. Fortunately, the Jewish graveyard, is still intact. Although I believe at some point all of the bodies were moved out of their graves into a common grave. But hopefully we'll be able to find that grave and see where Moses de Leon is likely to be buried. So why did Moses de Leon write the Zohar? Kabbalah was originally an oral tradition. In fact, the word Kabbalah means to receive. It was meant to be passed down from father to son or teacher to student. However, after the fall of Jerusalem, many Jews became concerned that this knowledge would be lost if it were not written down. Sometime in the 2nd century AD, one of the first overtly Kabbalistic works, the Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation, was written. Subsequent to that time, much of the Talmud was written. Subsequent to that, there were other Kabbalistic works written, but by far and away, the most important was the Zohar. The Zohar presents a comprehensive view of God, the quality attributes of God as represented by the Sephirot, how the Sephirot interact with one another, how God interacts with the world, and how we can interact with God. When Moses de Leon wrote the Zohar, it was written predominantly in Aramaic, which at that time was really only spoken or written by religious personalities in Europe, and a little bit of Hebrew. But it was the style of Aramaic that really led to the understanding that it was not the 2nd century Rabbi Shimon, who the Zohar is largely attributed to in the writing, that it was not an original work by Rabbi Shimon, but by Moses de Leon, writing it as a pseudographic work, which was very common at the time to give a religious work more credibility. There's an apocryphal story that Moses met up with Isaac of Acre, and Isaac was looking for Moses to see what supposedly Moses had, which was supposed to have been that original copy of the work written by Rabbi Shimon. Moses said that he would show it to Isaac of Acre before too long, but unfortunately he passed. Moses de Leon passed before he could show it to Isaac of Acre. Isaac of Acre then went to Avila here and met with Moses de Leon's wife, and she claimed that there was no such manuscript, that Moses had produced it solely out of his own creativity, and that he had done it to make the work more appealing, more believable, and perhaps to make it sell better. However, as I mentioned earlier, Jews were increasingly concerned that their works would be forgotten. So while Kabbalah was originally kept only to a few individuals who were believed to have spiritual qualities and the intellect in order to handle Kabbalistic teachings, times changed. And as Jews were more persecuted, they began to write down more of the more Kabbalistic teachings to pass them along to more and more people. And again, if one of the tenets of Kabbalah is to restore the world back to a time of goodness, then one would logically conclude that more people needed to know Kabbalah than fewer. Hence, I believe Moses de Leon wrote the Zohar with the intent that it be read by as many people as possible. Perhaps one of the most interesting revelations that came out of the Zohar and of the work written by Moses de Leon and perhaps other disciples of his was the idea that God is neither male nor female, that he is no thing, but that God has both male and female characteristics. On the tree of life, the tree that illustrates the Sephiroth, the second Sephiroth from Keter, which is the highest Sephirah, which represents God, the infinite God, Ein Sof. Below God is Chokmah, the singularity, And next to Hokmah is Bina, the mother, the creative mother. This is the first time we see any aspect of God is represented as female. At the bottom of the tree of life is Malkut, which is kingdom, also known as Shekinah, which is female. And Shekinah represents God's presence on earth. She's also known sometimes as the bride. She's also known sometimes to be similar to the assembly of Israel, meaning that she too, with the loss of the temple in Jerusalem, where she dwelt on earth, then had to leave during the destruction of the temple, and she then found her home within the Jewish communities. And that is why she is seen as a bride waiting for her mate, in this case, Tiferet, which is the Sephirah that we think of when we think of God as a king. And that leads us back to my earlier recollection that the way the Zohar is written is it uses the aspects of Jewish life, of prayers, of holidays, holy days, of the marriage between man and woman, and we see that in the Zohar that we are taught to love God as we love our spouse. We should love God as we love our wife. Our wife should love God as she loves her husband. Love is a central theme of the Zohar and of Kabbalah. Love is light. Light is love. It all comes from God. We want that light and love in our life so that we can rectify and purify the world back to the state it was in Eden before the fall. In practical terms, the Zohar paints a picture of a community of like-minded individuals who study Kabbalah, who read the Torah, study the Torah, innovate in the Torah, discover secrets within the Torah. Whether or not Moses and Leon belonged to such a community is unknown, but highly likely. Certainly many of the activities that the Zohar describes as to when certain prayers should be spoken, when certain days are best for receiving insight from God, certain holidays that lead up to important days for being able to receive spiritual guidance from Shekinah. For example, after Passover, we have the 50 gates that the Zohar refers to, which encompass the 49 days of wandering in the desert after the Jews were freed from Egypt until the receiving of the Torah on the 50th day. The counting of Omer during those 49 days, where each Sephirah is embedded in one of the other Sephirah, and we meditate upon those qualities, is a key aspect that teaches us that on that 50th day, after having meditated and thought deeply about the qualities of God for 49 days, that we have escaped bondage earned our freedom and are more likely to receive spiritual awakening on Shavuot, the 50th day. Moses and his companions would have stayed up all night on that last day, and they believed that in the early hours of the morning, perhaps somewhere between a dream state, that they would have received more powerful spiritual guidance from Shekinah into their own soul at that time. And I'm honored to be standing here now in Avila, where Moses would have spent the remaining years of his life and written a substantial portion of the Zohar. Tomorrow, I hope that we have an opportunity to learn more about where he lived, where he wrote, where the Jewish community thrived until the 15th century, and what happened after that. So thanks for joining me this far on our journey to better understand just who Moses de Leon was, what motivated him to write the Zohar, and how we can benefit from its knowledge and wisdom. I made this video because there simply aren't any other videos on YouTube like it. There seems to be very little information about Moses de Leon, about his life, about his death, about his experiences, his travels, whether he only traveled in Spain, whether he traveled to other parts of Europe and possibly to Israel. Very little is documented. But we know he spent considerable amount of time in Avila, and I haven't seen anybody talk about that. And so that's why this video exists, so that if you have an interest in Avila, Kabbalah, the Zohar, or Moses de Leon, this video is for you. I hope you like it.